you've ever made your turn in Magic Loop and feel like you can't get your needle all the way through the stitches, it has to do with that last stitch on your first needle being very, very tight. But how did it get that way? Well, it has everything to do with knitting the first stitch on the front needle. Here you can see that stitch is perfectly sized to my needle. Yay! But look what happens when I take this needle out, and now that perfectly sized stitch is on my cable. But if I pull back on that yarn too hard, either as a picker or a thrower, I've compressed the size of that perfectly sized stitch to my cable. So by the time I knit all the way across this needle, and I make my turn, and I try to push this needle back into the stitches, it's going to come across that teeny tiny tight stitch and be very hard to push in. So how do we solve this? Well, I'm going to show you two methods, one kind of standard and one extreme. First, simply by being aware. There's that stitch, perfectly sized to the knitting needle. So what I'm going to do is knit my first stitch just gently without yanking on that yarn, and I leave the stitch on the back cable sized well enough that I'll be able to slide that needle back on. I haven't compressed it all the way down to the cable. So this is the same whether or not you pick or throw. So as a thrower, I'm also going to be aware of that perfectly sized stitch. And when I knit my first stitch, I'm just not going to yank on the yarn that much so that I can leave it sized. So there it is, not compressed to the cable, it still has room. I will show you a more extreme method that I ended up teaching one of my students who just couldn't seem to not compress that stitch. So whether or not you pick or throw, if you find that you just yank at that stitch too much and you're having trouble leaving it sized, here's a rather extreme method, but it works. Enter the stitch you already knit on the cable and leave it there on the needle. Now knit the next stitch so that you've left this one sized. Park it back on the left-hand needle for a second so that you can remove your needle and continue. You've left that back stitch perfectly sized. Here that is again for throwing. If you're a thrower and you feel like every time you make that turn, you pull on that yarn too tight and you need to use my cheat, then the one thing you want to be aware of is that when you enter the back stitch and you enter the first stitch, make sure the yarn is coming from the back of both of them. It's as if these two stitches are next to each other on the needle. Now you can give a snug and knit the first stitch. And if you're a thrower who really yanks at their yarn, I would recommend you even knitting the second stitch, because that way you can't possibly enter the second stitch and tug and ruin all your good work. Now slip those two stitches that you just knit back onto the left needle so that you can remove the right needle, put them right back, and continue on. And as you can see, that back stitch is perfectly sized, and you can tug at that working yarn all you want, but because you've knit two stitches, that back stitch is going to stay sized and it won't compress.